All right, got it up and running at this point. Thanks, everybody, for the kind patience as we kind of get mushing along here. My cold is kind of overcoming me, and my common sense, which is limited at best most nights. I've got the concepts unit 4 that we're going to focus on in terms of metabolism. Looking at that, you can double-click this, download it directly. Also send it in the follow-up along with the recording for this particular unit for everybody who's in the cohort, either for this particular event, as well as the from the classroom cohort where we're kind of piecemealing it and working through the pieces one by one. What you're going to see, let me start sharing the screen here. We'll work through some of these pieces. All right, here, share. This is so the idea is we're going to kind of piece together how do we work on these big picture things, and particularly kind of have this visual for how both cellular respiration and photosynthesis work. What are the main pieces we need to know in terms of applying this information? How do we connect it to the other pieces, right, the other big units, that kind of stuff. In theory, it says, I do know it says cellular respiration to start off with because these are the pieces that I had on hand. So we've got the 3 steps of cellular respiration, followed by this last page, which should be a photosynthesis one. And that is part of this one that's downloadable here. And we're going to shake it around here at the bottom here, that Unit 4 concepts. I thought this was on the original one that I sent out. If it was not for any reason, I apologize. And I'm going to resend it out as a follow-up anyway, so you'll have access to this newer version. But hopefully you'll be able to have this one that also has the photosynthesis with it. But before we get to that, these are some of the kind of nuts and bolts, the final worksheet to take home with you, good things like that. Let's talk about how we get there and some of the big pieces that are most important. So here's how this starts. Oftentimes people get very buried in the cellular respiration and photosynthesis. There's lots of detail. We know that. But what's the most important? How do we connect it to bigger picture about how life is happening, other units in the course? And this is the way I like to think about it, all right? These two things are very interlocked. On one side, we have photosynthesis, and directly opposed to it, or not opposed to it, but connected to it, are cellular respiration. Now, and we can compare these very much directly on a totally different level besides the basic nuts and bolts that we're going to get to. We're absolutely going to do that. We can also talk about this on a much bigger, broader sense. And this allows you to kind of, if you're going to teach this to somebody, like I'm trying to help you learn it now, it's easier to couch it in a bigger discussion about why do we want to know these pieces, right? Why is it important to make this differentiation? How do they work together? Well, we'll start to see how I might connect those. So for instance, who does photosynthesis? Think about organisms on the planet. Who's the ones that are going to do the photosynthesis for us? These are very much plants to a certain extent, for the most extent, the ones we talk about a lot. Somebody else is typing here. And we have a certain number of bacteria can also do this. There's some limited amount of bacteria can also do this. Algae, yeah, that's a good example too. And I'm not spelling that right, so give me a second here. Yeah, but I'm sure you have a better spelling for me. What do you got? Hey! It's not telling me that. It's saying it doesn't like it, but there we go. Bacteria, algae, some of these kinds of things. Where does this happen? Inside that cell, what do they have that we don't have that allows them to do photosynthesis? What do they got? What have they got? They absolutely have a chloroplast, right? So these guys are, most of them are plants and bacteria. They do a chloroplast. Now, these guys are able to make their own energy. Now, if we connect them then to when we talk about ecology, so now we're talking about unit number 9, right? These organisms in unit number 9, because they can do photosynthesis, and we look at the food web, what role do they typically occupy? What do we call organisms that can do photosynthesis, and where are they on a normal food web? Yeah. So these guys are the producers, typically at the bottom of the web. Why did it make it such a big? That doesn't make any sense. Why did it make that so big? Wow, that's really bizarre. Okay, these are very much producers at the bottom, right? We also define them in another way as well. So not only are they producers, you know what we also call organisms that can make their own energy? So one is basically relative to their position, right? So you do photosynthesis and you're a producer. That's basically where you fit into the food web. Also, we can talk about how they make energy. They make energy by making their own. Do you know what we call an organism? Anybody have an idea what we call an organism that makes its own energy? It can make it itself. And so now we're not asking physically where is it in that web. Rather, how is it defined by its energy source? Give it a couple of seconds here. Oh, you're right on. Oh, Mike, that's very nice. It's autotroph. It's an autotroph, and the big key here is the idea that it's auto, right? It's like autopilot. It does it itself. It's an autotroph. So we can describe this photosynthesis as something that's specific to a certain kind of organism, and because the reason it can do that is because it's got a specific piece in its cells, a chloroplast, and then when we look at how that aligns it within bigger ecosystems like Unit 9, by the way, there's two levels here, right? This is, in fact, Unit number 3, right? Here's the main difference between a plant and an animal, right? This is a huge definition piece about cells, right? So this very much connects to all the units across the board. It also allows us to talk about autotrophs and producers that are typically at the bottom of the pyramid, right? In contrast, if we talk about cellular respiration on the other side, who does cellular respiration? All right. So definitely we've changed that name, and you're absolutely right. These are no longer producers. These are consumers. And they typically are, these are the upper levels, right? And then this is the thing that everybody struggles with. This is a very common one. In fact, this is everyone. Everybody eats the food. It's just that only some of them can cook it. Plants do both. Animals only do one. So people like it to be black and white, right? They want to be simplified. Well, plants are photosynthesis, animals are cellular respiration. It's not that simple. Animals are only cellular respiration. Plants do both. You can do either one. And that's because they have both pieces. The photosynthesis is taking place in the chloroplast. Where does cellular respiration take place? Any idea? Yep. Mitochondria. And these are no longer autotrophs. These are your heterotrophs. Hetero meaning something besides them, right? And so they eat things besides themselves. They are the upper level. So we have some major differences on either side that connects directly to how we think about Unit 3 and defining these organisms, and very much in terms of Unit 9 and how they fit into the relative position. All right? This is also going to we're going to start being able to connect some of these things, and you'll see very quickly how we're going to do that in terms of connecting the fact that you can make a web, right? But we can start to have some basic connection. Now, how are we going to work these out? Well, we're going to work them out basing it on a couple of basic sequential events that we want to be able to do. And we're going to focus on key pieces that we know are going to be important. The first way to think about it, that I like to think about, is as follows. It's because we're going to continue to work kind of forward to back. Hey, what in the world's going on there? There we go. Photo. We got photosynthesis here. We're talking big picture stuff, right? We want to be able to talk big pictures about it. So this we're going to make green because it's going to be our photosynthesis. And we're going to put a big old P right in the middle of it. There we go. And we'll make that bold. And, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Get rid of that thing here. Doop, doop, doop. That's not what I want. I want this one. Do this. Let me do this. There we go. See? There we go. That's what I wanted. Okay, we got photosynthesis. And the big things that you're going to want to do is, for all of these, as we get through them, what the steps for, we're going to want to basically have at least some sort of a functioning model, not a mosel, a model that's going to have be able to kind of remember these pieces and what do you really need to know. My hit list is as follows. Number one, the basic steps that are going to take place. Basic in and outs. And when I talk in and outs, we are going to focus those on the big four. Those big four they tend to be combined together. They kind of pair up, oxygen and water and carbon dioxide and glucose or sugar, which is synonymous. Where's my little deal here? Here, doop, doop. And then if we can tie it in, ATP is very far the next piece. And then the final piece is what I call the connections between reactions. And we'll get to that when we start breaking them down, right? Here's what I'd like you to be able to do. Honestly, my top four are right here at the top, and we'll make them red. This is what I really want you to be able to do. Basic steps. Where do the big four come in and out? Where does carbon dioxide and glucose? Where does water and oxygen come out? Can you put in ATP in that sequence? This can get you close to or answer most of the questions. Now, is there some connection between the reaction type questions and specific? Sure there is. But most of the time you can dead reckon and get close to those answers by knowing what pieces are associated, what steps are associated with the big four and how they're associated. This becomes bigger material, more bang for your buck. You can go farther with it is what I find. And so we kind of teach it backwards to look at the big picture pieces, and it helps create a visual model that allows you to address lots of questions and orient yourself correctly. And even if you don't get the right answer every time, you can eliminate lots of wrong answers, and that's really key. So, big picture. If I'm talking about photosynthesis, what am I trying to do with photosynthesis? What's the goal of photosynthesis for a plant? What are you trying to make? Make glucose, absolutely right. In order to do that, we're definitely going to use the power of the sun. And most people can remember that we've got the sun here. I'm sorry about that. I'm definitely off my game to a certain extent tonight because of this head cold. I'm kind of flopping around a bit. And most people want to remember that there's this light energy, this sun energy that's going on. And we also know that at the end we want to make glucose, which is synonymous with sugar, by the way. So whenever they say sugar, they're meaning glucose when they talk about the metabolism. So this we know we need to get out, right? And what do we put in? In order to do that, what do we have to put in order to get the glucose to come out? What kind of pieces do we have to put in there? Carbon dioxide and H2O. And these are going to go in sequentially, and I'm going to put them over here for just a second here. See why here. Just a moment. Actually, I'll just do it like this here. So what we find is basically water and carbon dioxide are going to go in. These guys are going in. And these guys are coming out. Oxygen and glucose. Just like this. Pretty straightforward. And what we find then is that this is really the basic sequences, right? We've got two things that are coming out, glucose and oxygen. Two things that are going in, carbon dioxide and water. And what's nice then is you can start to see the balance. But it's harder to see the balance when you break it down and get really small. And once you break this down further, it gets to be harder to see the balance. But if we start from the back, you can see the balance, right? There's an interaction between organisms that do these two things, right? The producers and the consumers. It's balanced the way up the ecology, whole organism level. It's also balanced at this level. But you can't see that if you only look at one side. That doesn't look very balanced, right? We have these two things coming out, these two things coming in. That's kind of balanced, but not very dramatically, certainly not visually. Well, here's where it's going to become much more balanced. Is if I take the same thing, I'm going to get to the side here, and do that here. And now I'm going to do this, and this now is going to be instead this is now going to be cellular respiration. So if this is cellular respiration now, what we find in cellular respiration is that these two things, so I put them in the same order, the carbon dioxide and glucose, and the water and the carbon dioxide, is that now what we find is these same four materials are utilized. And what you get is that now the glucose is what we eat, right? The glucose goes in, and the oxygen goes in. And now we put out carbon dioxide, and you put out water. Now, this also, and the other product, and let me refer, and then we get a little final piece here, which is now this idea that in the final thing that we're going to get out, and this is a big heavy, right? And one of the important things, and let me get it here, give me 1 second. We get this cool stuff, which is going to come out at the other side. I'm going to put it here, and we're going to do this. That's not what I wanted to do. We're going to make ATP on the other side, which is really nice because that's the energy that we're after, right? So here's cellular respiration. It looks, kind of messy like this one. We got the sun on one side, the other. Well, if I put these two together, again, this is a little complex and doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense when I look at it from one side. This side also has some complexity to it. Look at the other side. It starts to make a lot more sense if I put them together. Because what you realize is that these things that are coming in and out are the same things that are coming in and out over here. So if I put them together, what I'm actually doing is this. Is what I end up doing. I'm going to move these farther around because I'll show you the image here. It goes pretty cool. This is what I like about it. Is that these two things that are coming out of photosynthesis are then in turn going straight in to cellular respiration. And the things that are coming out then in turn of cellular respiration are going straight into photosynthesis. It makes a loop. And it's a loop that connects the sun coming in from one side with energy that comes out the other. So it's a feedback loop. So look at what we've done. All the material goes around and around and around. It's recycled. And all the energy comes in one side and goes out the other. We're just recycling and changing the forms of all this material to make to transfer the energy from the sun to a chemical form of energy that keeps us alive on this planet. It's all connected directly. And until you put all the pieces side by side, you don't see what I think is a pretty darn cool pattern. It makes way more sense. It's more intuitive. Of course it has to be that way. It doesn't, Angel. Photosynthesis does not produce any net gain of ATP. It only converts the sunlight into glucose. And then we have to use the cellular respiration to extract the ATP form of energy from the glucose. So the first step is conversion of sunlight to glucose energy. And the second step is the further conversion of the glucose energy into the final ATP. So only cellular respiration generates a net gain of ATP. There is ATP generated during the steps of photosynthesis, but the stuff we make, we immediately use. So there's no net gain. Only cellular respiration is there a net gain. So what's actually happening then? If you look at this in visual format then, what's going on, if you look at this, and I'm going to put these on the very, very specifically for a very specific reason, right? Here's the sun going over here. I'm going to make it a lot bigger, right? Here's your sun, this big old massive guy over here. So what's going on with this? Well, your energy, this is the whole idea, that energy moves through. comes in one end and eventually comes back out, and we use this, eventually comes back heat, and it goes back out into the universe. Energy moves through life on this planet. Imagine these are all your plants, these are all your animals, right? It's all part of this circle, right? This is just the energy diagram of the food web, of the food chain. That's all it is, right? Energy is going from one end of the planet to the other and back out into space. It comes in off of space from the heat from the sun. We use it here in different forms, and we send it back out into space as heat. It moves through the system. In contrast, if we look at the material doesn't move through. It's in the endless recycle loop, right? It's in here cycling around. So energy moves through. Matter or material cycles within. That's the difference. And they love a good question about this. But here's the difference, right? And until you put it together, it's hard to see that. But energy's coming in one end and going out the other. Material is just getting converted, and it goes around and around and around and around. Does that make some sense, how visually different those two things are, right? Matter just gets stuck on the planet. We have a defined amount of carbon, a defined amount of oxygen, a defined amount of water, a defined amount of blah, 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 blah. It just goes around and around and around. But what's the point of that? To convert energy from one side to the other and take sun energy and use it to power biological life. All right, that's the point, and they connect right together. This is an easier way to describe to someone to say, this is why we're learning this, right? This is why the pieces need to be able to fit together, because it's a cycle. You've got to account for what's coming in and coming out. That's why these are the big four, because it's what connects the cycle together. That's why they're the heavies, because they are the spokes in the wheel, if you will, right? All right. So this allows us to have a framework, which I don't think is overwhelming, to be honest. I mean, yes, there's some moving parts here, but I think having that bigger picture puts things in perspective a lot better about what you're trying to achieve, why you're kind of doing these different steps sequentially, those kinds of things. And so then it makes it easier to break down, focus a little bit about details, and move from there. All right. I'm going to pause momentarily while I blow my nose and do my audio. So give me 1 second here to blow my nose. I'm going to come right back. All right, back. Feeling a bit better here. We'll see if that holds. Who knows? We'll see what happens. All right, so let's go back and talk a little bit about, so what do we want to do for these different pieces? Well, we're going to have a little bit of the steps, still focus on where these big four are happening, and how does ATP play a role, and if possible, let's see if we can't get a little bit connected between the two, right? So let's start with photosynthesis. Two major reactions. We got two major reactions that take place. And so we've got here. And so we have light dependent. And I don't like the fact it does that, so I'm going to move it down here. There's light dependent. And simply enough, we're going to call it the Calvin cycle. All right. So we got two pieces. We know that they go in sequence. This is the first one. This is the second one. And then there's going to be some sort of a connection between the two, right? That these are the two reactions we've got to do. So we need to basically be able to place them in sequence. And we're going to use here's our pieces, right? So this is a great way. You can imagine being able to do this with a sticky board, right? And I can imagine like little velvet, the cutouts or things you put on board. Is you'd start with a discussion like this, right? You break down the super basics like this, right? This is what we're trying to do. Then I'd show this. This is what I'm trying to do, right? And then I'd show this and show how you could connect the two pieces into one diagram, which would be really cool, right? And for lots of students or different grade level stuff, this is more than enough, right? But this is very reasonable. And This is not outside the realm of possibility for a grade school type course, right? This is not overwhelming here. You've got some nice colors. You've got a diagram. Lots of kids can follow this through. You do kind of a cut and paste and you show how these pieces here, right, connect to these pieces here. It's very tangible. It's very cut and paste. Lots of nice color. I can imagine kids doing that. My daughter, my 8-year-old, loves this stuff, right? This is not undoable, and it makes a nice pattern. And you can focus on the pattern. This would be enough, right? But then if you're talking about that high school or that next level, you're talking about somebody who's going to be going into middle school or whatever, you might be able to start breaking them down. Even if you don't give them all the names, the idea that you could do this in sequence, right? This all doesn't happen in one box. This is like the black box, right? Let's take the black box out. Let's open it up, and let's look a little bit about what's going on in there. Well, we've got two major steps that take place. There's one that's light dependent. Now, the name tells you a lot about it. If it's light dependent, what do you probably need? Oh, go back, sorry. You're going to need your light, right? So the first step, the light dependent step, is where the light goes in. And this is, in fact, and what we're going to find, too, is that the reason I call these things paired, right? I talked about H2O and water together, and glucose and carbon dioxide, is they end up getting paired together. And so the first reaction that we find is that this is when we see the first two guys get together. The light-dependent reaction, this is where water goes in, and we're going to split water. And if you take the water and you cut hydrogen off of it, and that's not going to work because that's really silly. If I take water and I take this little line here, right? My goodness, so many modifications here. And I cut the water. What am I left with, right? What's the pieces? If I cut the hydrogens off this, what am I left with? I'm going to use light to cut water. What am I left with? You're left with oxygen. This is basically as simple as it is, right? This is literally how we make oxygen in this reaction. We literally use the power of the sun to cut water, and we kick out the oxygen because that's what's left. That was pretty easy. We just kicked out the hydrogens, right? That's all we did. We cut water. Done. Now, what does that leave us with? Well, it leaves us with a couple of things. It leaves us with some hydrogens. So we've got hydrogens here. We've got little hydrogens that are left over, right? And what I'm going to do is, so we've got a little pile of hydrogens that are hanging out. So we made some hydrogens. And the last thing we get to make is we actually make a little bit of ATP. So in the process of cutting hydrogens off, we also make a little bit of ATP. So we've got a little ATP here. I made a little hydrogens. And we're going to use these products to run the second step. So we did make ATP. Someone brought that up earlier. Do you make ATP? Absolutely you make ATP. But the ATP that we made, we're immediately going to use in the second step. So there's no net gain because what we make, we immediately use. And then what we're going to use that ATP for is to take it now, carbon dioxide in the second step. And now we're going to take in the carbon dioxide and we're going to use the ATP to string together the carbon dioxide. We're going to make a chain of carbon dioxide. And then we're going to bring over these H's. We're going to take all these H's here and we're going to bring them in over here and we're going to put the H's with this strung together carbon dioxide. If you take carbon dioxide, you string it together, you add H's, what do you think you make? What are we trying to make? What does the plant want to make from photosynthesis? Glucose. And this is how you make glucose. You take carbon dioxide, you string it together with ATP energy, and then we add these H's that we cut off of water. We put it on that chain, and we make glucose. There's your whole reaction right there. That's it. What these two reactions are effectively doing is taking the hydrogen off of water and putting it on carbon dioxide, stringing those together and making glucose. That's what they do. That's what photosynthesis is at a very basic level. Pardon me for the yawn. I'm fighting it. Yes. And then this is the last part. The last part is, how do these H's get over there? We don't just throw them over there, right? It's like the idea that we're going to carry them like a bucket with water. And we're going to you get water out of the trough, you walk it over, and you throw it on the fire, like the bucket brigade, right? So what you have is you have people walking back and forth. Some with water in their bucket that they walk over and dump, and they walk back with an empty bucket. They get water, they walk back, they dump it. They walk back over with an empty bucket, right? So we're going to bucket these over. There's going to be a bucket system. And as you pointed out, this bucket system is, this transfer system here is the NADPH. And what we find is, this fancy word, this is to a certain extent, this is the bucket, right? This is the bucket that we're going to use. And this H at the end, this H right here, I'm going to make it bold, underlined, and red. And all these H's here, get them all. There we go. Not so fast, you. Make them red. That's where it gets this last H. When you see NADPH, it's a full bucket with water in it because it's filled up with H's. So it transfers these H's over with the NADPH bucket. And then what it does is then it sends back the other way the NADP plus, and it's going to be an empty spot, so it's not underlined, it's not bolded, and it's just regular. This is the empty bucket, right? And I know, that's such a big, I don't like how big it is there. We're going to move this over. Give me a second here. Give me one moment. Come down here. There we go. The empty bucket comes back across, right? So it sends back the empty bucket. So it makes a little circle. And it actually does this with ATP too. So it works at actually both levels. And so, what am I doing here? Let me get this guy here. Let me move him up just a little bit. You see what I'm doing here? He's still moving across, okay? And you're going to make a mini circle in here. And the other thing that's going back is basically ATP kind of does its own little bucket system. It's kind of like that. And so it does, now it does ADP. And it's kind of this weird thing where it always goes down. I have no idea what it does that. It hates me. Must be the reason. And so you get this cycle between ATP to ADP where it basically fills back up ATP and comes back across after it burns it. And it fills up this bucket and sends back an empty bucket. Fills it up, sends it back. Fills it up, sends it back. Fills it up, sends it back. And that's all the NADP is. It's a bucket to shuttle the H's that we cut off of water, to dump them into the Calvin cycle with the ATP we made, string together carbon dioxide, add hydrogen, make glucose. I know that sounds like a lot of spots, but the biggest pieces that I really want you to know is light-dependent, Calvin cycle. Here's where water and oxygen are paired. Here's where carbon dioxide and glucose are paired, right? That's the things I really want you to know, and realize that ATP is made in the first and burned in the second. If you can remember anything about this bucket cycle, to me, that's more like gravy. There might be a question about it, right? But you're going to get way more bang for your buck by knowing these big pieces, and here's the big things that go in, the big things that come out, right? This connective loop here, it's valuable to know, but it's less bang for your buck than these big pieces on the outside, if that makes sense. All right? So, how are we feeling? I know there's some detail that we've added on here, right? But remember, the things you want to know is the sequence of steps on the big four in and out and where ATP. This connection is nice to know, but honestly, for most of the questions, I feel like it's a little bit farther down priority-wise. So how are we feeling about this? Better? worse remaining questions about photosynthesis, I'm going to start setting up for cellular respiration. If you have a few questions about photosynthesis, that's totally fine. Type it in the chat. See if we can hit as many as we can before we leave, right? We want to be able to do it as much as we can. Okay. So now we have 3 steps for cellular respiration. And I draw them in a different pattern. And I'll show you why. All right? I draw them in the inverted pyramid pattern. And it's because of the sequence that takes place. There we go. Glycolysis. And this guy, which is Krebs cycle. Guy, which is the electron transport chain. All right. So we have 3 pieces here. And I draw them in this sequence because I like to pair these top 2 together, and you're going to quickly see why and how we can kind of organize these units of events. Because what I find is it's easy to kind of think of these because what happens in the top is a bit different what's happening in the bottom, because the bottom 2 tend to be pretty paired together. Because the first top 2 are going to be the glucose carbon dioxide story, and the bottom part's going to be the oxygen story. So what we find is this. Now, the things that are going to happen when we need to break down this glucose. So now here, all that energy from the sun has been embedded in this glucose. But now we have to extract it back out and get ATP, because that's what we spend on a day-to-day basis. How do we do that? Cellular respiration. So the first half of these is very much about sequentially breaking down glucose in order to get ATP. All right? So how do we do? We're going to break down glucose, and we're going to do it in 2 sequential steps. We're going to put in glucose here, and it's going to cut it up part of the way, and it's going to make an in-between, more manageable piece. So it's not as big as glucose, but it's not all the way broken down yet, okay? So it's not all the way cut to its smallest level, and this is pyruvate. So this is another word you might encounter. The pyruvate is this in-between, and make it yellow, sure, why not? And actually, you know what? What I should do, it's kind of in here. There we go. I kind of like it in between. And the reason why is that the glucose is cut it down. Glycolysis has broken down glucose into pyruvate, which is a more easily used chunk of glucose, and then we immediately use the pyruvate to go to the Krebs-Simson cycle, right? It comes out of one and immediately gets cut up more, and the end product is we cut it up further to make it the original chunks that it came from. That were carbon dioxide, right? So it's a sequential cut down. We cut the big piece into a medium-sized piece, and then the medium-sized piece is cut further into the original small pieces. Because look, that's what we originally strung together to make glucose. We're just going to now cut glucose down sequentially to get back to it. So we're just going back the other way with one single intermediate. Now, what else did we put in to making glucose, right? If we look at the Calvin cycle over here, what did we do? To get glucose, we put in carbon dioxide, ATP, and H's, which we bucketed over with the NADPH. So what has to come out when we cut it back out, the CO2? We better be able to cut back out some ATP and some H's, right? Because that's what we put in. And guess what? That's exactly what we see. We see that both this step and this step both make a little bit of ATP. So we get some of that ATP that we put in. Now it starts to come out. And now this stuff we don't have to burn. This is all profit. So this is all profit here. So now we're starting to get wheels, right? Because we're making a little bit of ATP from both these. Now you're making a profit. And you don't spend that. Now we get to keep it. But what else had to come out? We didn't get any H's yet, right? The H's still have to come out because they went in. So the other thing we got to get out of here that we haven't gotten out yet is we got to get these H's. And we will. And what we find is that you get, give me a second. We find that we actually make a little pile of H's from this group over here. And you also make a little pile of H's from this spot over here. So as we break it down, the first breakdown, and then we cut it further down, we get a little bit of those H's from each side. So I hope this makes sense because look, out of the end, from breaking down glucose, we're just separating it out a little bit, but essentially from glucose we get carbon dioxide, ATP, and H's. What did we put in to make glucose? Carbon dioxide, H's, and ATP. We're pulling them just back out. We just put them in two separate steps. That's all we've done. We're just inverting it. Glycolysis paired with Krebs citric acid cycle is an inverse of the Calvin cycle. We're doing the opposite of what the Calvin cycle did, and we're doing it in the first two steps of cellular respiration. That's it, right? And we've already used two of these pieces. Glucose goes in, here goes CO2 that you breathe back out from your lungs. It goes back around and makes that loop that we finally connect here at the end, right? CO2 went in to make the sugars. We pulled it back out of the sugars here, and now it comes back out. There's that part of the loop, right? Well, we got to complete that loop. Well, how do we complete the loop? We're going to do this last step. Well, how do we power the last step? We power the last step by pouring the H's that we made here into this, and we pour the H's that we made from here into this. So the H's, once again, are what pair the first two. This is why I have these two on the top and these on the bottom, right? Because they basically both filter down into it like an hourglass, right? These two products from both these steps pour into this one and run the third one. And we're making ATP on the side. And guess what? We're going to do the bucket reaction again. But instead of using the NADPH bucket, we just use a different bucket. So we're going to use the exact same idea, except we're going to use a different named bucket. So instead of being the NADPH bucket, we just get rid of the P because the P stands for photosynthesis. So it's the NADH bucket. There's our NADH bucket. And it circles back, right? Just like this one, the bucket also circles back. But it's not NADPH, right? It's going to be the empty bucket is just going to be NAD, right? And I'm going to even abbreviate that further so we can put it in two places, right? This is our empty bucket, if you will, right? And this is going to cycle back in two spots, right? It's going to go back over here, right? So this is the bucket system over here. It's using this same bucket system back and forth, right? To pick up H's and come back. It's using back and forth. And it's using that bucket system over here. The exact same system, right? Same bucket system. It just has two bucket brigades going side by side that are carrying the H's that are pulled out of these first two reactions and pouring them into the third. The only other piece here that we do not have is this side over here uses one additional bucket system, all right? So NADH is used by both sides. This guy uses one additional system. Only the second reaction over here. He also has a secondary bucket. He's got a special bucket that only he uses. It goes back and forth just like that one. But instead of being the NADH bucket, which both of them use, he has a separate one that's only for him. And it is the FADH2 FAD. So that's their empty full bucket, right? And these are the ones that are the underlying. Remember, these are the ones that are the hydrogens that are being carried over. So he has a second bucket system. That's the difference. That's it right there. So there's kind of two separate kind of little buckety systems, but they're doing the exact same idea. Shuffling the hydrogens that we produce from one side over into the next reaction. This is why I talk about I'm less concerned that you know all the details on how they're connected, right? just the basic hint about how that kind of shuffles over is going to go a long way. I'm much more concerned that you know these big pieces, right? The idea that we're pulling back apart glucose in 2 sequential steps. We're making ATP from both steps. This is where glucose comes in. It's transferred over in this intermediate form of pyruvate as we cut it part of the way, and then we spit it back out after it's fully been cut down to CO2. That I'm much more concerned about. This connective piece, that's why I do it. It's got a lot of detail here, right? This is how we cycle the bucket brigade. This does happen here. It's very much real, but that doesn't give you nearly as much information as all the rest of this stuff does at the top. And that leads us to a final reaction, which is, what do we do with all these H's that we dump into the system, right? We bucket brigaded a ton of H's over here. What do? Well, what we do is we then basically use oxygen. And oxygen is used to combine with these hydrogens that are coming in. And if you add hydrogen back to oxygen, what do you get? You remake the water that you started with. Look at what we're doing here. We're doing the opposite of the original reaction where we split water and made O2. We're reuniting these hydrogens that have gone on this weird, crazy trip back to the oxygen and making water. And in this process, we use this gradient that is created by this system, and we make a whole bunch of ATP. Pardon me while I'm going to blow my nose one more quick time. I'll be right back. All right. Thank you so much for hanging in there with me as I fight through the cold this evening. And that's the big payoff here is at the end, where at the end now, we're going to get a whole batch of ATP that comes out here at, where do I put it? I'll put it over here. All right. All right. So now we get even more ATP by utilizing these H's that we pulled out and putting them through this little chain reaction down here where we recombine them with water and with oxygen and make water. All right. And here's the reason we do this. Why do we go to all this trouble with this bucketing system to get one more squeezed out piece? It has to do with the amount. On average, this makes 2 ATP, and this makes 2 ATP. In contrast, this guy, he makes 32 to 34 ATP. That's why we do it, because there is so much more payoff, and we get so much more ATP by doing the third step. This is why you breathe. You breathe to put oxygen in your body so you can do this third step, because that's where you get so much most of your energy when you burn sugars, which are your favorite fuel. If you didn't breathe, you couldn't do the third step. All right? And this is going to do a final analysis when I look at this big picture-wise, okay? Hang with me here for one last little piece. And I'm going to take this thing here, this big old massive thing here, and how else might you ever look at this? Well, if I took a lot of this sequence out of the middle, right, and I don't worry so much about what this bucket's going on here, and this bucket, we know that there's all this bucketing system, right, that's going on between them, so we know they're connected kind of back and forth. In particular, the most important part is that these H's are coming down and interacting, right? Well, one of the things you really should notice about this is that this first side here, this first sequential breakdown, does make some ATP, and what's really important is it doesn't need oxygen. Oxygen's down here on the bottom half of this line. So this upper half is, if I look at this, is what we call anaerobic respiration. This is when you do respiration without oxygen. When you do the whole thing is aerobic respiration when it requires oxygen. So just the top half is aerobic respiration. In your body, you're doing both. When there's oxygen available for tissues, it does the whole thing. When there's not oxygen in around, it just does the top half. And you have muscles that are designed specifically to do this. And so you can make a living, right? It's not a good living, but you can make these ATP up here without needing oxygen to get the huge payoff. You can't do it long term, but you can do it in little pockets of your body for short periods of time. Now, some organisms are designed to do this entirely and never do this step. That means they don't even have to have oxygen, right? Because they don't do this third step at all. Organisms that are designed to do nothing but anaerobic respiration look a little bit different than us. Their version of this is slightly different, not very different, but it very much resembles this, right? They break down glucose in multiple steps without oxygen to do the third step. They get some ATP from it, and that's enough for them to survive. Much smaller, non-multicellular organisms for the most part. That is called fermentation. So that's what fermentation is. Fermentation is the anaerobic respiration components, these steps that you can do without requiring oxygen that do make some ATP. So some life lives doing just this top half. It allows them to live in places where there's no oxygen, which makes them super competitive, right? Because most organisms need oxygen. So they can live in these pockets where there's goodies to eat, but they don't fight other organisms for those goodies. So it's a very exclusive club, and they can survive pretty well, even though they don't make as much energy. So they have to be very specialized with their metabolism. They don't make a great living doing it. We wouldn't survive with that much energy, but they are usually very small, usually single cellular, those kinds of things. All right. I know this was a breakdown. I know there's a lot of pieces here, but hopefully when you start to see it a little bit more sequentially, that can kind of make some sense. I hope that makes some sense as we kind of break it down. I also highly recommend Google image searching these things. They've got great diagrams that are fairly straightforward that breaks these down. I've probably have gone as long as I can, or anybody wants to listen to me sniffling this evening. So thank you for that. There's a documents for that you can get, or the concepts for, where is it, down this way? Yeah, down that way. You can download and get another little worksheet to kind of work on this. These are simple things to practice too, right? What I would suggest to people is once you've kind of worked through it, see how this coincides with the LR, see how you do on quizzes at the end of modules, the unit quiz. What I would suggest you do before the exam is take a blank piece of paper. Can you put the heavies? Can you put the big sequence of events? Can you put the ins and outs of these big four? Can you add where ATP fits, right? And any of the other detail, that's great. But the idea is if you try that a couple times from scratch with nothing in front of you, just blank memory, right? What can I put down? This becomes visual, becomes connected. And then what I'd like you to be able to do then is do a very simplified form of this, right? This, maybe this, without a lot, you don't necessarily have to have all these spider web, right? But could you do the basics? And the idea is that as soon as that metabolism question comes up on the exam, you put that on your whiteboard. And now you've got that visual in front of you to help you orient what the question's saying. And half the time it's not about knowing the answer. It's about knowing what isn't right, right? So it's like, well, the Krebs cycle, which produces glucose. No, it doesn't. Glucose goes in over here. There's no production of glucose. There's no output of glucose, right? So simply by knowing the ins and outs of the big four, usually can eliminate answers right off the top of the bat just by knowing where those big four are coming in and out. Just these big four, right? Just these big four. Knowing this base pattern, right? This much more streamlined pattern really helps eliminate answers that cannot be true and really focuses down on your potential answers and allows you to focus as the question is designed to get the most accurate answers, right? So oftentimes you don't have to know the answer. You got to know what's not right, how to focus your gaze at the things that could be right. All right. Thank you so much for hanging in there with me. Look for a follow-up with this with email, and let me know how I can support moving forward. And hopefully I'll feel much better by Friday, and we can continue to talk about cell division, Unit 5, which is the next big heavy, and we can talk a little about mitosis and meiosis and how we kind of break it down the same way, compare and contrast, back and forth. What are we going to be looking for in questions? Because that's what we're focusing on. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Hang in there. Hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Continue on with the week, and let me know how I can support from my end. Okay, I'll drop the recording, the audio, and the visual at this point, and look for that follow-up from me. And hope everybody has a great rest of the night. Thanks, guys.